The blizzard had passed 2 hours before dawn, leaving the borderlands between territories deadly quiet except for the wind through skeletal pines and the distant sound of blood moon sentries calling the watch change. Jill Sipple lay crumpled in fresh powder at the forest's edge, her crimson wedding gown, meant for tomorrow's ceremony, now torn and darkening with blood, her ribs screaming with every shallow breath she managed to take, but she couldn't call for help. The wolfsbane Marcus had forced down her throat made sure of that. Blood had frozen in streaks down her neck where she'd clawed at the carriage door before he threw her out. Her fiancé, the man who'd courted her with poetry and promises for 2 years. She remembered his face in those final seconds before she hit the snow. Not the face of the man who'd knelt before her father to ask for her hand. Something darker, more ruthless. "You should have stayed ignorant, Jill," he'd said, his voice cold as the winter air. "I offered you everything. A crown. Power. A place at my side when your father falls. But you had to find those letters. You had to threaten to warn him. You had to play the loyal daughter." Now she was freezing to death in enemy territory, and no one would find her in time. But someone did find her. Someone who should have left her to die. If you want to know what the Lycan Prince did when he discovered his mortal enemy's daughter dying in a snow, and why his choice shocked even his own soldiers, tap that like button right now, because this story of blood feuds, impossible bonds, and a prince who defied everything for his fated mate is just beginning. And, trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when Jill wakes up in his fortress. Before we get into the story, take a second to subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know if this story reaches Canada, the United States, Australia, Africa, or the United Kingdom. Let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. The numbness had reached her fingertips 30 minutes ago. Jill Sipple didn't remember when she stopped shivering. That was supposed to be a bad sign, something her father had taught her during winter survival training when she was 12. When the cold stops hurting, you're already dying. She laughed then, safe in the warmth of the great hall with hot cider in her hands. She wasn't laughing now. Her eyes wouldn't focus properly. The sky above had turned from black to gray, dawn bleeding through the storm clouds, and somewhere in the distance she heard hoofbeats. Heavy. Purposeful. Coming closer. "Run," her mind whispered, but her body wouldn't obey. The horse stopped so close she felt the heat radiating from its massive body. Then boots crunching in snow. Footsteps circling her slowly, deliberately. She tried to lift her head and failed. "Silverwood colors," a man's voice said, low and edged with something dangerous. "And a wedding dress. How convenient." Jill forced her eyes open. Through the haze of pain and cold, she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in dark fur and leather armor that bore the silver wolf insignia of the Blood Moon Empire. Long dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his eyes, those eyes, burned amber in the early light as he stared down at her. Harris Gant. The Lycan Prince. Her father's enemy. She should have been terrified. Instead, something else entirely slammed into her chest like a physical blow. A pull. A recognition so deep and visceral it made her gasp. No. Not him. Not this man whose mother her father had killed. Not the prince who'd sworn vengeance against Silverwood at his mother's funeral. Harris went completely still. His eyes widened, pupils dilating as the same recognition clearly hit him. For 3 heartbeats, neither of them moved. "No," he said, his voice rough. "This is a mistake." But even as he said it, he was dropping to his knees beside her, his hands reaching for her before he could stop himself. The moment his bare hand touched her frozen cheek, heat exploded through her system. The mate bond, ancient and absolute, roaring to life between them. "Your father killed my mother," Harris said, and his voice shook with fury and something else, something lost and raw. "He cut her down during a peace summit. I've spent 10 years planning how to destroy everything he built." Jill tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged. "Then, leave me." His jaw clenched. She watched him war with himself, watched vengeance and fate collide in his expression. His hand was still on her face, his thumb unconsciously stroking her cheekbone, and she could feel his pulse through the bond now, racing as fast as hers. "Marcus Draven," Harris said finally. "Your beloved fiancé. He's been sending letters to half the packs in the territories, promising them pieces of Silverwood once he kills your father and takes control. I have 12 of those letters in my study." Jill's breath caught. "So here's my choice, Jill Sipple." Harris slid his arms beneath her, lifting her against his chest as he stood. She should have fought. Instead, she found herself leaning into his warmth, into the inexplicable rightness of his touch. "I can leave you here to die and let Marcus start a civil war that will destabilize every pack from here to the coastal territories. Or I can save the daughter of my enemy, claim my fated mate, and use you to stop the bastard before he tears everything apart." He looked down at her, and despite everything, the history, the hate, the impossibility, she saw the truth in his eyes. He'd already made his choice. "Hold on," Harris said, and carried her toward his horse. Jill woke to firelight and the smell of herbs she didn't recognize. Her body ached everywhere, but the wolf's bane had worn off enough that she could feel her wolf stirring weakly beneath her skin. She was alive. Warm. And in a bed that wasn't hers. The room was stone and shadow, lit only by the hearth and a single oil lamp on a heavy wooden table. She sat up slowly, biting back a groan, and found Harris Gant standing at the window with his back to her, silhouetted against the night sky. "Your ribs are cracked, not broken," he said without turning. "The healer said you'll recover fully in a week. 2 if you don't shift." "Where am I?" "The Obsidian Keep. My home." He finally turned, and in the firelight his face was all hard angles and unreadable shadows. "You've been unconscious for 18 hours. Your father doesn't know you're missing yet. Marcus has told Silverwood you're visiting your aunt in the Eastern Territories before the wedding." Jill's hands fisted in the furs covering her. "You said you have letters." Proof of his conspiracy. 12 letters, 3 signed confessions from lesser alphas he tried to recruit, and a detailed account from one of my spies who infiltrated his inner circle 6 months ago. Harris moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Marcus plans to kill your father during the wedding feast. Poison in the ceremonial wine. He'll blame Blood Moon, use your supposed death in our territory as justification for war, and seize control while the pack is in chaos." The room spun. Jill forced herself to breathe. "Why would you help me stop him? You want my father dead." "I want justice for my mother. Not a civil war that will leave every pack vulnerable to the human militias gathering in the lowlands." Harris crossed his arms. "Marcus is sloppy, ambitious, and stupid. He'll get thousands killed. That's not vengeance. That's waste. So you save me out of pragmatism. I save you because fate bound us together whether we like it or not, and I won't let my mate die." His voice dropped, rough with something that made her skin prickle. "But I'm not a fool, Jill. Your leverage. Your access to Silverwood. You're the key to stopping Marcus without starting the war he wants." Jill pushed herself upright despite her ribs screaming in protest. "Then here are my terms, Prince Gant. You help me save my father. Not kill him later for revenge. Save him. You give me the evidence and the resources to stop Marcus, and you stand beside me when I do it. In exchange for what? The alliance you want. A consort bond that makes our union official." She met his eyes, refusing to flinch. "But I keep my autonomy. I'm not your trophy or your tool. I'm your partner or I'm nothing." Harris was silent for a long moment. Then he moved to the table, poured 2 glasses of dark wine, and brought one to her. "A consort bond requires a blood oath, spoken in front of witnesses under the moon. It's binding, Jill. Permanent. You'd be tied to Blood Moon. To me. Your pack would call it treason. My pack left me to die in the snow." Her voice didn't shake. "What do you call it?" Something flickered in his expression. "Respect, maybe. Or recognition." He raised his glass. Then we have an agreement. I help you save your father and destroy Marcus. You become my consort and help me build a peace that should have existed years ago. A peace your mother would have wanted? His jaw tightened, but he nodded once. A peace my mother died trying to create. Jill lifted her glass, and when their eyes met over the rim, the mate bond hummed between them like a living thing. Dangerous. Inevitable. Impossible to deny. To impossible choices, she said. To the future they create, Harris answered, and they drank together in the firelight. The obsidian keep earned its name. Black stone towers rose against the morning sky like frozen shadows, their walls carved with ancient pack symbols that predated the territorial wars. Jill stood in the courtyard as dawn broke over the Blood Moon capital, wrapped in borrowed furs that smelled of pine and smoke, and tried not to feel like a traitor. Harris walked beside her, his presence steady and unmistakable. Wolves gathered in clusters throughout the courtyard, and every single pair of eyes tracked her movement. She heard the whispers. Silverwood. Alpha's daughter. Enemy. Some faces showed curiosity. Most showed contempt. They'll need time, Harris said quietly. My mother's death is still fresh for many of them. Before Jill could respond, a man emerged from the main hall. Tall, scarred, built like he'd been carved from the same stone as the keep itself. His gray eyes fixed on Jill with an intensity that made her wolf bristle defensively. Commander Thorne, Harris said. My second. Thorne, this is... I know who she is. Thorne's voice was gravel and ice. He looked at Harris, his expression hard. You brought her here. Into our home. The daughter of the man who murdered our queen. She's my fated mate. She's a Silverwood spy wearing your protection like a shield. Thorne moved closer, and Jill forced herself not to step back. How convenient that Marcus Draven left her to die exactly where you'd find her. How convenient that she has information about a conspiracy. How convenient that she needs your help. Harris's voice went deadly quiet. Are you questioning my judgment? I'm questioning hers. Thorne's eyes never left Jill's face. Your mother trusted a Silverwood delegation once, my prince. They came under a peace banner and left her bleeding in the snow. Forgive me if I don't believe history won't repeat itself. The words hit like a physical blow. Jill's throat tightened, but she met Thorne's gaze directly. My father made a choice that haunts me every day. I can't change what he did. But I'm not him, and I'm not here to cause more bloodshed. Pretty words from a pretty prisoner. That's enough. Harris's command cracked through the courtyard like a whip. She's under my protection. That makes her untouchable. Am I clear? Thorne's jaw worked, but he inclined his head. Crystal, my prince. He turned on his heel and stalked away, several warriors following in his wake. Jill released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Don't take it personally, a woman's voice said from behind them. Thorne doesn't trust anyone, and he loved the queen like a mother. Jill turned to find a woman approaching, maybe a decade older than herself, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back severely and a jagged scar running from her temple to her jaw. Her eyes were kind despite the hardness in her face. Elena, Harris said, and something in his voice softened. My chief healer. She's the one who treated you. Elena studied Jill with an assessing gaze that felt nothing like Thorne's hostility. Your ribs are healing well, but you're favoring your left side. Still in pain? Some. Come to the healing wing after midday meal. I'll prepare a poultice. Elena glanced at Harris, then back to Jill. And if you need to talk to someone who isn't the prince, my door is open. This place can be overwhelming for outsiders. She's trying to say that half the keep wants you dead and the other half just wants you gone, Harris said dryly. Elena smiled slightly. I was trying to be diplomatic. But yes, essentially that. She touched Jill's arm briefly, a gesture of surprising warmth. Survive the first week. After that, they'll at least respect your resilience. As Elena walked away, Jill looked up at the black towers looming above them and wondered if a week would be enough time to learn how to survive in the heart of enemy territory. Or if she'd need a lifetime. The training yard was frozen mud and blood-stained snow. Jill hit the ground for the 8th time that morning, her breath knocked from her lungs, her body screaming in protest. Above her, Harris stood with his practiced sword lowered, his expression as cold as the winter air. "Again," he said. She wanted to stay down. Every muscle in her body begged for mercy. Instead, she dragged herself to her feet, adjusted her grip on her own wooden blade, and raised her guard. Harris moved like liquid shadow. He disarmed her in 3 strikes, swept her legs, and put the tip of his sword to her throat before she could blink. "You're still fighting like a diplomat's daughter at an exhibition match," he said. "Elegant. Proper. Useless." He offered his hand and pulled her up. "In a real fight, Marcus won't care about form. He'll care about killing you before you can expose him." "Then teach me to kill him first," Jill said through gritted teeth. Something flickered in Harris's eyes. Approval, maybe. He stepped back and shifted his stance. "Forget everything your tutors taught you about honor in combat. There is no honor when you're fighting for your life. Only survival." He moved slowly this time, demonstrating. "Strike here the knee, it buckles easily. Here, the throat, it collapses. Here, the inside of the thigh where the blood runs hot and fast." Jill watched, memorized, and when he came at her again, she aimed for his knee. He blocked, but she'd expected that, used his momentum against him, and drove her elbow toward his ribs. He caught her arm, but she was already pivoting, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she saw surprise flash across his face. "Better," he said, and the single word felt like victory. The weeks bled together into an endless cycle of dawn runs through the frozen forest, weapons training until her hands blistered and bled, and strategy sessions that lasted into the night. Harris was merciless. He pushed her past exhaustion, past pain, past the point where she thought she'd break. And somehow she didn't break. She hardened. Elena's lessons were different but no less brutal. They sat in the healing wing, surrounded by herb bundles and ancient texts, and the older woman taught her the things Silverwood would never speak of. "Poison is a woman's weapon because men underestimate it," Elena said one evening, grinding something dark and pungent in a mortar. 3 drops of nightshade in wine bring sleep. 5 brings death. Learn the difference." She looked up, her scarred face serious. "But poisons are for cowards unless you have no other choice. You want to survive court politics, Jill? Learn to read people. Learn what they want, what they fear, and how to give them just enough of both to keep them loyal." "That sounds like manipulation." "It's called leadership. Your father does it. Harris does it. Marcus is trying to do it and failing because he thinks violence and ambition are enough." Elena set down her pestle. "You're going to walk into the lunar summit and face the man who tried to murder you. You'll need more than sword skills. You'll need to know which alphas can be swayed, which ones Marcus has already bought, and which ones are waiting to see who's stronger before they choose a side." Jill absorbed it all. The combat training, the political maneuvering, the small cruelties and large strategies that kept a pack in line. By the 6th week, she could disarm Harris 1 time in 5. By the 8th week, she'd earned a nod of respect from Commander Thorne after she put one of his warriors on his back during sparring. But it was Harris's words on the final night of training that stayed with her. They stood in the empty yard under a sky full of stars, both of them bruised and exhausted. He looked at her with something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "You're not the woman who woke up in my fortress 8 weeks ago," he said quietly. "No," Jill agreed, feeling the truth of it in her bones. "I'm not." The memorial stood in a clearing deep in the heart of Blood Moon territory, far from the keep and the capital's noise. A circle of standing stones surrounded a carved marble monument, and in the center, an eternal flame burned in a bronze brazier, despite the wind that cut through the winter forest. Jill followed Harris through the snow, her breath misting in the cold air. He'd said nothing when he'd found her in the library that morning and told her to come with him. She'd learned to recognize his silences by now, the ones that meant anger, The ones that meant calculation, and this one, which felt like something heavier. Something that hurt. He stopped at the edge of the stone circle and stood there for a long moment, his shoulders tense beneath his heavy cloak. Queen Morgana Gant, Jill read from the monument. Mother. Leader. Peacemaker. Taken too soon by those who feared what she could build. My mother believed the territorial wars were destroying us, Harris said, his voice rough. She thought if the old grudges weren't buried, eventually there wouldn't be enough of us left to matter. So she reached out to your father. Proposed a summit. Neutral ground, both parties unarmed, witnesses from 3 other packs to ensure fairness. Jill's throat tightened. She'd heard the Blood Moon version of events, that her father had murdered the queen in cold blood. She'd heard her father's version too, that it had been self-defense, that Morgana had betrayed the terms of the summit. She'd never known which story was true. What happened? She asked quietly. Harris moved closer to the flame, his face illuminated by its light. Someone poisoned the wine. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to make both delegations violently ill. In the chaos, one of my mother's guards, a man named Roth, who we later learned was being paid by the mining consortiums that profit from our wars, drew a blade. He paused, his jaw working. Your father reacted. He thought it was an assassination attempt. In the confusion and the panic, he struck first. And killed her. She died in his arms, actually. Harris's voice cracked slightly. I read the witness reports. All of them. Your father held her while she bled out. Kept saying it was a mistake, that he didn't know, that he thought she was reaching for a weapon. He finally looked at Jill, and his eyes were wet. She was reaching for him. Trying to tell him about the poison. Trying to warn him that someone wanted them both dead. Jill felt tears spill down her cheeks. Harris. I've hated your father for 10 years. Planned elaborate revenges. Sworn oaths over this flame that I'd destroy everything he built. Harris's hands clenched at his sides. And then fate gives me you. His daughter. My mate. And I find out that the conspiracy we're fighting against isn't new. It's the same poison that killed my mother, just wearing Marcus's face now instead of Roth's. He turned to her fully, and the vulnerability in his expression made her chest ache. I brought you here because you deserve to know the truth. Your father isn't the monster I made him into. He's just a man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of fear. Harris took a shaky breath. And I'm just a son who's been carrying grief and rage for so long I forgot what it was for. Jill closed the distance between them and took his hand. For a moment, he resisted, then his fingers curled around hers, desperate and tight. She would have liked you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. My mother. She would have seen what I see. Someone brave enough to stand in enemy territory and fight for what's right, even when it costs you everything. I'm sorry, Jill said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. I'm so sorry for what my father took from you. Harris pulled her close, and she went willingly, wrapping her arms around him as he buried his face in her hair. They stood there in the snow beside his mother's flame, 2 people bound by fate and history and grief, and let themselves finally be vulnerable. When they walked back to the keep hours later, something between them had shifted. The alliance was no longer just strategic. It was real. The eclipse began at midnight, the moon sliding into shadow like a promise being sealed in blood. Jill stood in the ceremonial circle atop the highest tower of the Obsidian Keep. The entire Blood Moon court gathered below in the courtyard, their faces upturned and watchful in the torchlight. She wore a gown of deep silver, the color of moonlight on snow, with the Blood Moon wolf embroidered in black across her heart. Her hair fell loose down her back, and around her throat she wore a collar of ancient silver, the mark of a consort, not quite a queen, but more than a mate. Harris stood across from her in black leather and fur, his long dark hair pulled back, his amber eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her skin burn despite the winter cold. Between them, Elder Cashin held a ceremonial blade, its edge gleaming in the dying moonlight. Before witnesses and under the eye of the moon goddess, we gather to bind two souls in the ancient rite, Cashin intoned, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. Harris Gant, Prince of Blood Moon, do you claim this woman as your consort? Do you offer her your protection, your loyalty, and your blood? I do. Harris's voice didn't waver. I claim Jill Sipple as mine. I bind my fate to hers. What threatens her threatens me. What strengthens her strengthens my house. Cashin turned to Jill. Jill Sipple, daughter of Silverwood, do you accept this bond? Do you forsake your former pack and pledge yourself to Blood Moon and its prince? This was the moment. The point of no return. Once she spoke these words, Silverwood would consider her a traitor. Her father would believe she'd chosen his enemy over her own blood. Marcus would use it as proof that she deserved to die. She thought of her father, of the home she'd known, of everything she was giving up. Then she looked at Harris and thought of everything she was choosing instead. I do, she said clearly. I accept Harris Gant as my mate. I pledge myself to his house and his people. My loyalty is his. My strength is his. What harms him harms me. The eclipse reached totality, the moon vanishing into complete shadow, and the world held its breath. Cashin raised the blade. Then let blood seal what words have spoken. Harris held out his palm. The blade cut swift and clean, blood welling dark against his skin. Jill offered hers next, barely flinching as the steel bit into her flesh. Cashin pressed their hands together, their blood mingling as ancient words in the old tongue spilled from his lips. The mate bond, which had been a constant hum beneath Jill's skin for weeks, suddenly roared to life. Power surged through her veins like lightning, and she gasped as heat exploded across her left shoulder blade. Harris's eyes widened, his own mark clearly burning into his skin in the same moment. When Cashin released their hands, Jill reached back and felt the raised skin, a wolf's head, intricate and permanent, seared into her flesh by magic older than memory. The mark of a bonded mate. The proof of her choice written in her own body. Harris touched his right shoulder where the matching mark had appeared, then looked at her with something fierce and possessive and tender all at once. The moon began to emerge from shadow, light returning to the world. It's done, Cashin announced, his voice ringing out. Witness the consort bond. Witness the joining of Blood Moon and Silverwood blood. Let all territories know that Jill Sipple is under Prince Harris Gant's protection, now and forever. The courtyard erupted. Some cheered. Others remained silent, their disapproval clear. Jill heard her name on dozens of lips, heard traitor and betrayer mixed with consort and brave. Harris stepped forward and took her marked hand in his unmarked one. No going back now, he said quietly. No, Jill agreed, feeling the weight of the bond settling into her bones, changing her on a fundamental level. Only forward. He pulled her close and kissed her under the returning moon while their people watched, and the mark burned bright between them, announcing to every Lycan territory that the impossible had happened. The enemy's daughter belonged to Blood Moon now. The intelligence arrived 3 days before they were set to leave for the lunar summit. Jill was in the war room with Harris, Commander Thorne, and Elena, studying maps of the summit grounds, when a scout burst through the door with a sealed letter bearing no pack insignia. Harris broke the seal and read in silence, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Jill's. Marcus isn't working alone, he said quietly. He has support on the Summit Council itself. Thorne swore viciously. Which counselors? 3 confirmed. Possibly 4. Harris set the letter down. Alpha Vern of the Ridgeback Pack, Counselor Iris from the Western Territories, and Elder Garrett who sits as neutral arbiter. He paused. They've been promised territory and trade rights once Marcus takes control of Silverwood. And they've agreed to block any evidence we present unless we can prove the conspiracy beyond any doubt. Elena leaned forward, her scarred face grave. If the council is compromised, they could rule against you before you even speak. They could declare Jill's testimony invalid, claim she's a scorned bride lying for revenge. Or they could have us arrested the moment we set foot in neutral territory, Thorne added. Claim Harris kidnapped an alpha's daughter, that the consort bond was forced. It would give Marcus everything he wants, Jill discredited, Harris imprisoned, and justification for war. Jill's hands clenched on the table. So we don't go. We find another way. There is no other way. Harris met her eyes. If we don't appear at the summit, we look guilty. If we don't present the evidence publicly, Marcus consolidates his power and your father dies. We have to go. We just have to be smarter than they're expecting. For the next 2 days, they planned. Elena compiled dossiers on every counselor, every alpha, every witness who would be present. They identified potential allies, packs who had no love for Marcus, alphas who valued honor over political gain. They prepared contingencies for every scenario, every betrayal, every trap. But nothing prepared Jill for the moment she stood in her chambers the night before departure and stared at the dress Elena had laid out for her. Silverwood colors. Blue and white, the ceremonial garb of an alpha's daughter, with the blood moon wolf embroidered subtly at the hem. You have to remind them who you were, Elena said softly from the doorway. Before you show them who you've become. Jill touched the fabric, remembering the last time she'd worn these colors. The night Marcus had thrown her from the carriage. The night her old life had ended. They're going to hate me, she said. My own people. They'll see me walk in with Harris, and they'll think I betrayed everything. Some will. Elena moved to stand beside her. But others will wonder why the alpha's daughter, who everyone knew loved her father fiercely, would abandon her pack unless something was deeply wrong. You're not just evidence, Jill. You're a question they can't ignore. Harris found her an hour later, standing on her balcony and staring out at the darkness beyond the keep. He wrapped his cloak around her shoulders and pulled her back against his chest. We could run, he said quietly. Forget the summit. Forget Marcus and the councils and all of it. Take a ship to the coastal territories and disappear. Jill leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. You don't mean that. No. His arms tightened around her. But I wanted to offer it anyway. She turned in his embrace and looked up at him. My father is in danger. Your territories are in danger. We're the only ones who can stop this. I know. He touched her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. I just wish stopping it didn't require walking you into a room full of people who want you dead. Then stay close, Jill said, rising on her toes to kiss him. And make sure they know I'm not alone anymore. They left at dawn, a convoy of 20 Blood Moon warriors, and with every mile that brought them closer to the summit, Jill felt the weight of what was coming settle heavier on her shoulders. She was going home. And home was going to call her traitor. The lunar summit hall was exactly as Jill remembered, soaring stone columns carved with the histories of every pack, hundreds of wolves gathered beneath ancient banners, and in the center, the council dais where the 5 counselors sat in judgment. The air smelled of pine smoke and tension. Every head turned when Harris Gant entered with Jill at his side. The whispers started immediately, a wave of shock and fury rippling through the assembly. Jill kept her chin high, her hand resting lightly on Harris's arm, the consort mark visible on her exposed shoulder. She found her father in the Silverwood delegation, saw his face go white, saw the betrayal and confusion war in his eyes. Then she found Marcus. He stood at her father's right hand, exactly where a trusted beta should stand, and his expression was perfect, shock giving way to righteous anger. You dare bring her here? Marcus's voice rang out across the hall. The woman who abandoned her pack, who betrayed her people to bed our enemy? Careful, Draven. Harris's voice was ice. You're speaking about my consort. I'm speaking about a traitor who should have died in the snow where I left her. The hall erupted. Jill heard gasps, heard her father's choked cry of rage. Alpha Vern rose from the council dais, his face carefully neutral. This is a serious accusation. Marcus Draven, are you confessing to attempted murder? I'm confessing to defending my pack. Marcus's eyes never left Jill's. She discovered sensitive information and threatened to reveal it to enemies. I did what was necessary. The sensitive information, Harris said, his voice cutting through the noise, being your conspiracy to assassinate Alpha Sipple and seize control of Silverwood through a coup supported by 3 members of this very council. The hall went dead silent. Harris gestured, and Commander Thorne stepped forward with a leather case. 12 letters detailing the conspiracy. 3 signed confessions from Lesser Alphas Marcus recruited. Bank records showing payments from Ridgeback and Western Territories. And testimony from the merchant Marcus hired to procure oleander poison, the same poison he plans to use tonight during the ceremonial feast. Counselor Iris stood abruptly. This is an outrageous fabrication. Then explain this. Elena emerged from the crowd, holding a small vial. Found in Marcus Draven's personal effects this morning. Oleander extract. Enough to kill 20 wolves. Jill watched her father's face as understanding crashed over him. Watched Marcus's mask of righteousness crack. Watched the moment everything changed. You lying bitch, Marcus snarled, and his hand went to the blade at his belt. Everything happened in seconds. Marcus lunged not at Jill, but at her father, the poisoned blade aimed at the Alpha's throat. Silverwood warriors moved to intercept, but they were too slow, too shocked. Jill saw her father's eyes widen, saw death coming for him. She moved on pure instinct. 8 weeks of training, of Harris drilling her until her body knew what to do before her mind could hesitate. She drew the knife from her thigh sheath and threw. The blade took Marcus in the throat. His momentum carried him forward 2 more steps before he collapsed at her father's feet, blood pooling on the ancient stone, his eyes wide with shock and rage and disbelief. The hall erupted into chaos. Wolves shouted, warriors drew weapons, but Harris was already moving, positioning himself between Jill and the crowd, his own blade drawn. Commander Thorne and the Blood Moon Guard formed a protective circle. Elder Cashin's voice boomed across the hall. Stand down. All of you stand down. Slowly, reluctantly, the assembly quieted. Jill stood with blood on her hands, Marcus's blood, and met her father's eyes across the body of the man who had almost destroyed them both. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you. That I had to do this. But he would have killed you, father. Tonight. And blamed it on Blood Moon to start the war he wanted. Her father moved slowly, carefully, around Marcus's corpse until he stood before her. For a long moment he just looked at her, at the mark on her shoulder, at Harris standing protectively beside her. Then Alpha Sipple pulled his daughter into his arms and held her while she finally let herself break. 5 years later, the borders between Blood Moon and Silverwood no longer existed. Jill stood on the balcony of the newly built Unity Hall, watching the sun set over land that had once been a battlefield and was now a thriving market town where wolves from a dozen territories traded freely. Children played in the streets below Blood Moon and Silverwood and Ridgeback and Western, their pack affiliations meaningless in the face of the peace that had become normal for them. He's walking, Harris said from behind her, wonder in his voice. She turned to find her mate holding their son, Callum, who was indeed taking unsteady steps across the balcony, his chubby hands gripping Harris's fingers for balance. The boy had his father's dark hair and his mother's determination, and the amber-flecked green eyes that marked him as something entirely new, the first child born of both bloodlines, the living symbol of what had been impossible. Jill knelt down and Callum lurched toward her with a delighted squeal, collapsing into her arms. She held him close, breathing in his scent, and felt Harris settle beside them, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. The delegation from the Eastern Territories sent word, he said quietly. They want to sign the Accord. The Accord of Winter. The treaty they'd spent 3 years drafting, negotiating, fighting for. The document that had transformed from a simple peace agreement into something revolutionary, a commitment that no pack would wage war on another, that disputes would be settled through council arbitration, that the old blood feuds would be buried in favor of unified prosperity. 12 territories had signed in the first year. 23 now. And the Eastern Territories would make it 26. Your mother would be proud, Jill said, looking up at Harris. His expression softened. Our mother, he corrected gently. She would have loved you. Loved this. He gestured to the town below, to Callum playing with a wooden wolf figurine, to the banners flying from Unity Hall that bore both the blood moon and silverwood emblems intertwined. Everything she died trying to build. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face brightening when she saw Callum. There's my favorite little prince. And before you protest, she added, looking at Jill, he's been officially designated a prince by both councils, so that's what I'm calling him. Is it time? Jill asked, standing and lifting Callum to her hip. Your father and Commander Thorne are already in the Great Hall. Half the territories have sent representatives. Elena's scarred face showed satisfaction. It's quite the crowd for a treaty signing. They walked through halls that had been built as a neutral meeting ground, walls carved with the names of every wolf who had died in the territorial wars, a reminder of what they were leaving behind. The Great Hall was packed with alphas, counselors, warriors, and common wolves alike, all gathered to witness history. Alpha Sipple stood at the front, older now but still formidable, his eyes finding Jill's as she entered. Beside him, Commander Thorne, who had become an unlikely friend once he'd seen what Jill and Harris were building, held the accord document. Jill and Harris took their place at the center, Callum still in her arms. The boy looked around at all the faces with wide, curious eyes, and someone in the crowd laughed softly. 5 years ago, Jill began, her voice carrying across the hall, I was left to die in the snow for discovering a conspiracy that would have torn our territories apart. 5 years ago, the man standing beside me made a choice that defied logic, defied history, and defied hate. Harris took up the thread. We stood before you at the Lunar Summit and exposed corruption that reached the highest levels. We've spent every day since building something better. Something our children deserve. The Accord of Winter represents more than peace, Jill continued. It represents the promise that our children, all of our children, will never know the wars that defined us. That they'll build on hope instead of blood. She looked down at Callum, who had reached out to grab one of the decorative wolves carved into the podium. This is for them. For every child who shouldn't have to carry their parents' grudges. For every wolf who's tired of burying pack mates over borders and pride. The alphas came forward one by one to sign. The Eastern Delegation. The coastal packs. Even some of the northern territories that had held out, resistant to change. Each signature was a choice. Just like Harris's choice in the snow 5 years ago. A choice to build instead of destroy. When the last name was inscribed, Jill looked out at the assembled wolves and saw her father's proud smile, Elena's tears, Thorne's approving nod. She saw the future they'd fought for finally arriving. Harris pulled her close, Callum between them, and kissed her temple. We did it. No, Jill said, looking at all the faces in the hall, at the banners of 24 territories united under one roof. We're still doing it. Every day. Together. And in the fading light, the Empire of Two Moons stood strong, built not on conquest, but on an impossible choice made in the snow, and all the choices that followed after. Before you go, drop a comment and tell me, what moment hit you hardest? When Marcus threw Jill from the carriage into enemy territory. When Harris stood over her dying in the snow and chose to save his fated mate instead of claiming vengeance. Or when Jill threw the blade that killed her betrayer to protect her father. Could you have accepted a blood pact with your enemy when your own people had left you to die? Would you choose to become a warrior princess in a hostile court over returning home to certain death? If this story of impossible choices and fated bonds resonated with you, hit subscribe. New stories of enemy mates and dangerous alliances drop every week. Until then, may you find the courage to trust fate, even when it binds you to the last person you expected.